This man had loved her for more than 50 years, and during their long marriage, they were happy and truthful. Or so he thought, because, just moments after her untimely passing, he discovered something that would lead him on a search, revealing an unbelievable truth that would change his life forever. He loved her for over 50 years, but discovered the truth after her death. 50 years ago, Edward was in high school. He sat in the same class as a beautiful girl and was in love with her from the first moment he saw her. Slowly but surely, he gathered his courage to ask her out even though he thought she was way out of his league. It was to his surprise that she said yes, and in the following years, he had to win her over, going on the most romantic dates and spending the holidays together. After 5 years, Edward felt confident enough to go down on one knee and ask her the most important question of his life. That was 45 years ago, as they had just celebrated their anniversary. They spent the weekend in a cabin with the whole family, remembering fond memories and making new ones. But this happy moment would soon take a dark turn as Margaret suddenly became ill not long after they returned home. After a few months of sickness and being in and out of the hospital, his beloved wife passed away in the presence of her family and loved ones. Edwards was now tasked with the most difficult task he ever had: organizing the funeral for the woman he had loved for over 50 years. Once the day came, all the memories flooded his brain with all the fond memories he had with his wife. Edward found support in the family that gathered there. Suddenly, in the corner of his eyes, he noticed someone. All alone in the corner of the room stood a person he didn't know. Once the unknown person noticed that Edward had seen him, he gestured for him to come over. Edward was confused as to who this man could be. He organized the funeral and created the guest list, and this person certainly wasn't on it. With that in mind, he went toward the person. Maybe he didn't recognize the person from far away, he thought as he made his way over. But with every step, he became more sure this person wasn't supposed to be here. Before he could say anything, the mysterious person handed him something. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I need to talk to you." Edward's heart skipped a beat as he looked down at what the person had given him. It was an old photo of his wife. "We can't talk here. Meet me at the address on the back," the person continued. Edward was still taken aback and didn't know how to respond. "Who are you?" he eventually got out. The person, however, had no intention of answering that question and just pressured him to come over as soon as possible. Questions started forming inside Edward's head. "Why do you want to talk to me? Why can't we talk here?" But still no answer. Edward wanted to try and get answers, but he suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder. One of his family members urged him to come back and talk to the rest of the family. "I will come shortly," he said. But when he turned around, the mysterious person was gone. Confused, Edward returned to his family. He was intrigued by the person and looked at the picture he got. There was no question about it, that was his wife. How did that person get this picture? He thought about it for a moment and then decided. "I'm sorry, but I have to go." That announcement was met with lots of resistance. How could he leave his own wife's funeral so quickly, he heard someone say. He had to give it to them. It was a little peculiar, but he had thought it over. His decision was final, and he had to know what that person had to say. "I'm really sorry. I can't thank you enough for all the support, but I must leave." Edward made his way through the crowd toward the door. On his way, he passed a couple of confused family members asking where he was going, but he ignored them, unaware of where this decision would eventually lead him. Edward nervously entered his car. With clammy hands, he entered the address in the navigation system. He didn't recognize it, but it appeared to be not that far from the funeral home. Is this right? He thought to himself, but to reassure himself, he put his foot down hard on the pedal and drove off. The drive gave him time to think. He thought long and hard about how he possibly could have met the person before. Was it a distant relative or some in-law he forgot about? It didn't matter how hard he tried. In the end, he still didn't know who the person could have been. Meanwhile, the city was long gone, and Edward was driving on a dirt road that led to a big farm complex. He wasn't that close, but even from here, he could see that the buildings were poorly maintained, if at all. This, however, sparked some curiosity inside him as he came closer and closer. It didn't take Edward long to figure out what the main building of the farm was as he parked his car in front of it. The main house was big but looked a bit grim and run down. He believed there hadn't been anyone in ages. Then he noticed the front door was open. He decided to enter and stepped foot into the hallway. It must have been beautiful, Edward believed, as he felt a sense of past glory. Such a shame, he mumbled to himself. He continued his journey through the house and entered the living room, ready to find out what that person wanted to share. To his surprise, however, there was no one in the room. Confused, he called out, "Hello?" But there was no response. Why did he have to come over? And why did he have to hurry if there wasn't even someone here? Edward didn't want to wait around and decided to look around. The stairs creaked under his feet while he walked upstairs, running his hands along the damaged railing. Exploring mindlessly, he entered the first room he came across, but once he stepped foot in the room, a strange feeling came upon him. An eerie sense of déjà vu got to him. Had he been here before? The room he stood in was a study, and it stood out from all the other rooms in the house. The study was clearly well maintained, as it was furnished and there wasn't a speck of dust to find. On top of the desk stood a specific picture that caught his eye. Edward walked toward the desk and grabbed the picture. It's another picture of his wife when she was younger. This time, there were more people on it, and he didn't recognize anyone. He had never seen this picture before. He suddenly got the creeps thinking about how these pictures got here. What's going on? Pictures weren't the only thing on the desk, however. It took a while as he was distracted by the picture of his wife, but in the middle of the desk lay a diary. Curious, he grabbed and opened it. Maybe it had some information about why he had to come here. Then he realized. The diary was written in his wife's handwriting. He wanted to read it, but before he could even read the first sentence, he got interrupted by a sudden voice. "I didn't expect you this soon." Edward recognized the voice. There was no mistaking it. He turned around quickly to see if his expectation was right. As he expected, it was the mysterious person from the funeral home. How did he suddenly get here? Edward hadn't heard anything while this house creaked in all places. He was still holding the diary, hoping to find answers. But it was like the mysterious person could read his mind. "You must have so many questions," the person said while gesturing to follow him. He led Edward toward two rundown chairs and sat down. Edward stood there, diary and picture in hand, deciding in his head what to do. The person was right, he had many questions. Where did he start? After deliberating, Edward finally sat down. Gripping the journal tightly, he asked who the person was, what this place was, and why he had to come here. "So you don't know anything," the person responded with a smirk on his face. The next thing out of his mouth would shock Edward to his core. "My name is Samuel, but most people call me Sammy." Edward, his heart skipped a beat when he heard that name. He knew that nickname, but from where? The mysterious person saw the shock on his face. "Rings a bell, does it?" Then Edward remembered where he knew the name from. It was his wife. He remembered vividly now. His wife frequently went to visit a friend named Sammy, and he always thought it was one of her female friends he hadn't had the pleasure of meeting yet. Edward never expected it to be a mysterious man he would meet in some rundown house. Now that he knew where he had heard the name, something else clicked into place. While his wife was sick, she mentioned the name Sammy more often. She would take every opportunity she had to go for a visit. Edward let her as it was one of her last wishes. "Why did my wife visit you so often?" "Who are you exactly?" he said while walking back to the study. He put back the diary and picture and waited for Sammy to answer, but there came no answer. He wanted to ask again, but before he could say anything, it struck him. From the moment he had set foot in the study, he had felt an eerie feeling of déjà vu. Now he remembered why. They had had a picture in their living room of his wife when she was young. In the picture, she was standing in this exact room with a small boy. It all started to make more and more sense, but Edward still hadn't had a clear answer from Sammy. He mentioned the picture to him, and finally, Sammy felt like answering. Yes, that little boy was me. Your wife and I grew up together before you knew her. This surprised Edward. Edward's eyes widened as he heard Sammy talk. His wife never mentioned she had such a friend since childhood. Not knowing the unbelievable things that would follow. We weren't just friends. We were foster siblings, Sammy continued, explaining that they had lived together and had been staying in touch ever since. Edward couldn't believe what he was hearing. His wife never told him any of this. Had she been lying to him his whole life? He shook the thought out of his head. What was he thinking? Of course not. Why would he even believe this person he didn't even know? As if Sammy saw the doubt running through Edward's mind, he started to explain even more. How they had lived together for 2 years right here, in this very house. Eventually, Edward's wife got adopted by a different family, and Sammy stayed behind with the foster family they had been placed with. Sammy told Edward he hadn't been as lucky as he didn't get adopted. When he turned 18, his foster family packed their bags and left. They were kind enough to leave him with this rundown farm. He had to fend for himself ever since. If not for Edward's wife, he probably wouldn't be here anymore. As it turned out, she was the only person to really care about him, and she kept visiting him through the years. Edward could finally speak up. I never knew. He felt confused and even slightly betrayed by his beloved wife. Apparently, she never felt safe to tell him all this. Even his wife's family never told him otherwise, so he was convinced that they were her birth family. The thoughts ran through his head. Did they know about Sammy? Did they know she had been visiting him through the years? Why had no one told him? He wouldn't have minded at all. Have you been living here, on your own for all these years? Edward eventually asked after he had processed the story. Sammy told him he had been living here, but mainly in the barn building. It had been tough, but thanks to Edward's wife, he was able to live a good life. She always came by to help me, and together we maintained this study, Sammy explained. It was a dear memory to both of them, so they worked hard to keep it alive. When they got older, it became harder and harder, and when she got sick, it became impossible for her. Sammy took it upon himself to maintain the study, so every time she would visit, they would still be able to relive their fond memories. They would read books, tell stories, and look at old pictures together. The last time she visited, she wrote something for you and asked me to hand it over. Samuel pointed at the diary. She wanted you to have it. Edward grabbed the diary he earlier recognized with his wife's handwriting in. So it did have the answers, he thought. He opened it and flipped through. It was almost entirely filled. Suddenly, when he got towards the end, an envelope fell out. Inside the envelope was a letter, and Edward immediately recognized the handwriting of his wife again. Dear Edward, the letter started. Those words were enough to bring tears to his eyes. Through a watery gaze, he continued to read the letter, detailing everything about her past and confirming what Sammy had told him. Edward burst into tears after finishing the letter. It meant the world to him that he had been able to read this letter. Thank you so much, he told Sammy. Thank you for convincing me to come here. Edward felt like he had to repay him but didn't know how. Until Edward thought of the perfect way to thank Sammy and build their relationship. He felt like he owed it to his wife to bond with her foster sibling and dear friend. I've got a great idea, Edward said as he started to explain to Sammy what he had come up with. Would you really do that? Sammy asked, both surprised and amazed. He didn't know how to react. You would really help me rebuild the entire farm? Edward nodded at him. If you're up for it. It didn't take Sammy long to hold out his hand, gesturing that he was ready. Edward smiled as he shook hands with Sammy. He knew this would have made his wife very happy, and it brought tears to his eyes thinking about how this would be the perfect way to honor her memory. But first, he had to go back to his family. He couldn't wait to tell them. Over the next years, Edward would regularly visit Sammy at the farm, bringing all types of equipment and tools with him. They started with the main building and restored it to its former glory, after which they continued with the rest of the farm. In the process, the two became close friends.